This is number 14 on the 5.1 notes about integration and antiderivatives. So let's take a look. It says a satellite radio station launched an aggressive advertising campaign 16 days ago in order to increase the number of daily listeners. The station currently has 27,000 listeners, and management expects the number of daily listeners given by the function s of t to grow at a rate of s prime of t given by 60 times square root of t listeners per day, where t is the number of days since the campaign began. Then we're asked how much longer should the campaign last if the station wants the number of daily listeners to grow to 41,000 listeners. Okay, so there's a lot going on here. Now remember, anytime you have a word problem, you got to figure out what your functions are representing. So we have an s of t function, and that's calculating the number of daily listeners, okay? And then my input t there, this input t is the number of days since the campaign began. And then we have another function going on. It's s prime of t, and that's the rate at which the number of listeners are growing. So got a lot of things going on. Let's label them. Okay, so I labeled the input and output of both of my functions here. And now let's think about what they're asking. We're being asked how much longer should the campaign last? How much longer should the campaign last? Well, that's a number of days since, right? So this is going to be related to t. We're kind of looking for an input there. But how much longer should it last? Where t is the number of days since the campaign began. It began 16 days ago. So we got a lot of stuff going on here. Began 16 days ago, and they're already up to 27,000 listeners. T is the number of days since it began. So what that's telling me here is this. It's telling me that if I put 16 days ago, because T is the number of days since the campaign began. If I put 16 days since the campaign began and they're already up to 27,000 listeners, and I want to know how much longer it should go, we're starting at this 16 days and we're continuing from there. So I'm actually going to take the t days since the campaign began, and I'm going to take those 16 days off because they've already been going for 16 days, and whatever's left over will be how many more days they should continue on. So that's a little tricky with some careful reading. But then it's also saying, so how much longer should it last if they want the number of daily listeners to grow to 41,000? So basically what I need to do is I need to figure out my s of t function. And then I need to figure out, what would I have to input into this function, right? How many days, so that I shoot out 41,000 listeners. And then I'll adjust that number of days minus the 16 to see how many more days, how much longer it should go. But we weren't given the s of t function, but that's okay. We can find it because I know if I have the derivative of s, and I take the integral, the antiderivative of it, it's going to give me s of t back plus some constant. And I can use this extra information here to figure out what this value of c is. And then I'll have a particular function for this scenario. And then I can use that particular function to answer my question, to figure out when are they going to hit 41,000 listeners and how many more days does that have to continue. So let's do all that. So I set up my integral. I have my bookends here. And then I just replaced my s prime of t with the function they gave me. And now I need to rewrite that because that doesn't fit any of my rules right now. So I'm going to rewrite that to be 60t to the 1/2 dt. And then just to make sure it follows my rules exactly for my reverse power rule, I'm going to pull that 60 out of my integral. That's not required, but I'm going to do that. And now this is set up perfectly for my reverse power rule. So when I go ahead and follow that reverse power rule, the 60 is along for the ride, and then it's going to multiply to t to the 1/2 plus 1 over 1/2 plus 1, and then I'm going to add the generic c, which we'll figure out in a minute. Right now I'm going to keep it generic. So let's go ahead and clean that up. So I went ahead and cleaned that up. I figured out my exponent and what I'm dividing by, and then in my calculator I just typed 60 divided by the fraction 3/2, and I got 40t to the 3/2, and that I'm claiming is my generic s of t function. But I want the particular one for this problem. So now I'm going to plug in 16 days ago. And then I'm going to figure out what would C have to be to output 27,000 listeners. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to scroll up a little bit here. Okay, when I plug 16 into this function, I'm going to get 16 to the 3/2 power plus C, and I need to get a 27,000 out. So I'll just type in my calculator real quick. 16 raised to the 3/2 power. That gave me 64, so I really have 40 times 64, and that is going to give me 2,560 plus C equals 27,000. And then I'll just subtract that 2,560 from both sides to figure out my particular value of C. Okay, so we found that. So now I have a particular function. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite it. It's 40t to the 3/2. And instead of plus C, I'm going to add 24,440. And now let's slow our brains down and ask, wait, what in the world is this telling me? If I plug in a number of days since the campaign began, so since campaign began, oops, how do we spell oh my God, Kelly, campaign began, then this is going to calculate the total number of daily listeners. Okay. So now what we're going to do next involves a little bit of algebra, but let's just go back and think about what we were asked. We were asked, how much longer should the campaign last? That's an input. We're plugging in number of days, right? So we're looking for an input that's going to create an output of 41,000 listeners. So this is what we're trying to figure out here. We're trying to figure out what would I plug in to get 41,000 out. So when I set this up, it's going to say, okay, what T that I plug into this function is going to output, oops, a lot of fours there, 41,000. So the algebra on this is a little tricky, but we can do it. Here we go. Let's take a look. So yeah, whenever I have a variable or an equation that's kind of like hard to solve for, I need to locate my variable. My variable is here. It's a base, so it's trapped by this exponent, and it's also being multiplied by 40. So my first job is going to be to isolate that term. So I'm going to subtract my 24,440 on both sides to get that isolated. And now again, here's my variable. It's a base with this exponent. So now I need to isolate that, and it's being multiplied by 40. So I'm just going to divide by 40 on both sides. Okay, so far the algebra has been normal. We're just isolating a variable. But now this variable is being raised to the 3/2 power. And there's lots of different ways you can get that variable alone. But the slickest way is to say, okay, I can do anything to the left-hand side of this equation, except multiply by 0, as long as I do it to the other side, right? So I could square this side as long as I square that side, but that's just not super helpful to me because I just want to get a plain old t. So we have an algebra rule that says if I raise the left-hand side to the exponent, the reciprocal of the exponent, let's see what happens. What's 3/2 times 2/3? Well, that's just 6/6, which is an exponent of 1, which is what we want. So I'm just going to raise both sides to the reciprocal of the exponent. And then over here, I'm going to get t to the first power, which is what we want. And then I'll just type that into my calculator to get the other one. So 414 raised to the 2/3 power. I'm being careful to use my fraction button. Or you could just make sure you group that exponent in parentheses so your calculator will know that that exponent is a fraction. And then I get 50, well, I'm going to have to round. 55.5 days. Okay, so what is that saying? That's saying about 55 and a half days after the campaign began. After the campaign began, they'll reach that number. Okay, and we were asked how much longer should it go? So it takes 55 and a half days to reach 41,000 listeners. And in this problem, they've already gone 16 days. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that 55 and a half days and I'm going to subtract the 16 days that have already passed. And then the remaining days are how many more days, how much longer they need to go. So it's 39 and a half days. So we'd probably say they need to go, about 40 more days. and then they'll hit that 41,000 listener mark. Okay, so this problem took a lot of careful reading. You really had to understand the input and output of your functions. So after you watch this video, maybe try to recreate it on your own cold turkey. And if you're still struggling, come see me in office hours or reach out to our instructional associate or to your classmates. Talk to each other. Math is a language. You got to talk it out.